All right, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are in chapter 13. It is titled Operation Aka. Or this way. Let's do this way. Nate skimmed the Piper cruiser as close to the surface of the Kerreri River as he dared. The muddy river curled below him like a sleeping snake among towering trees. Nate and Ed had just finished their 9th gift drop to the Aka village on the next river over, south from the Kerreri. The weather was clear and there was no wind, so instead of flying directly back to Arahuno, Nate decided to follow the twisting brown Kerreri River in the hope of finding a suitable landing spot not too far from the Aka settlement. About 4 miles by air from the Aka village, or a 6-hour slog by foot along a jungle trail, Nate spotted a possible landing place. It was a white sand beach perched between the jungle and the slow-moving river. He circled the plane back for a better look. It seemed promising, straight and wide, but was it long enough for landing? Thankfully, Nate had planned ahead. He asked Ed McCauley to reach into the back of the plane and grab the cardboard carton there. As Ed pulled the box into the front and lifted the lid, a puzzled look spread across his face. The box was filled with neatly stacked small paper bags, each filled with something heavy and tied shut. Nate grinned. He loved to keep his friends guessing. Finally, he explained the bags to Ed. The paper bags were filled with flour, and if they were dropped on the ground from a height, they would burst and the flour would spill out. If Nate flew the plane at a constant speed and Ed dropped the bags at set intervals, say every 2 seconds, they could count how many bags fell onto the beach. Then, when he flew back to the Shelmera airstrip and dropped the same number of bags at the same time intervals and airspeed, he could measure the distance between the first and last flour bombs and determine how long the beach actually was. Ed nodded as Nate banked the Piper around for another pass over the beach. Nate slowed the plane's speed to a steady 60 miles per hour. Ed looked at the second hand on his watch. He let go of the first flour bomb bag, then a second, and a third. He had dropped 5 bags by the time the beach disappeared beneath him. They headed back to Shelmera, and once again, Nate steadied the plane's speed at 60 miles an hour. Ed kept his eyes on his watch as he dropped 5 more flour bomb bags 2 seconds apart. Nate landed the plane and he and Ed measured the distance between the first and last bags, 210 yards. The beach on the Kerreri River was 210 yards long. Nate whistled. It was going to be a tight squeeze landing and taking off in that distance, but it could be done. Nate would have to pay close attention to the weight in the plane, though. Every extra pound of weight meant the Piper cruiser would need another foot of landing and takeoff room. Tight as it might be to land and take off there, Nate was sure it was the best landing strip they would find. They named the strip Palm Beach because of the palm trees that surrounded it. Now that they had a place to land, they could make firm plans for their trip into Aka territory. The men decided they would land, set up camp on the beach, and stay there for 3 days and nights. Jim Elliott volunteered to draw up plans for a simple treehouse where 3 men could sleep in safety high above the jungle floor. He would pre-cut all the timber so it could be put together quickly once they got to Palm Beach. Jim had some leftover scraps of wood from the new house he'd just built at Shandaya. Nate would use a sling system to fly in some sheets of aluminum for a roof. Nate was concerned about leaving the plane on the beach overnight. For one thing, if it rained heavily and the river flooded, the beach could easily be covered with water in 20 minutes, making it impossible to take off. Or worse, the plane could be washed away. It would also be impossible to protect the plane during the night. While the men were sleeping in the treehouse, the Akas could destroy the plane and leave the missionaries with no way to escape. Everyone agreed it would be best if Nate flew out each night and returned the following morning. That way he could also bring in fresh supplies. Planning for the final stage of Operation Aka was well underway when the sun rose over the jungle on the Orient on Christmas morning, 1955. The Saint kids were ready for action. Kathy poked Phil until he woke up, and then she hoisted him out of his crib. He had no idea what Christmas was, or even that it would be his first birthday in a few days. But Steve and Kathy needed as much help as they could to get their parents out of bed. The three of them hurried into their parents' bedroom to remind them there were presents to open. Nate smiled as three little blonde heads appeared over the edge of the bed. He could remember as well as anyone the childhood lure of unopened presents. He and Marge got up, and while Nate dressed Phil, Marge made a large pan of oatmeal. With the noise in the kitchen, the rest of the household awoke. 5 other children were staying in Shell Merita. They were older children who had come down from Quito to spend Christmas with a family rather than in their dorms at school. Their own parents were missionaries who, for one reason or another, couldn't be with them for Christmas. Nate and Marge welcomed them to their home with as much love as if they were their own children. Soon the pan of oatmeal had been devoured, and it was time to open presents. 4-year-old Steve had a pretty good idea what his present was. His dad had spent hours building a model railway, complete with papier-mâché landscape. The track even wound around a model of Mount Sangay that came complete with a red light at the top and streamers that shook during eruptions. As Nate handed the model railroad over, Steve's eyes lit up. Nate smiled. It was fun to have a son who liked the same things he had liked as a boy. It brought back memories of the B&T and P Depression Railroad he and his brothers had built as children. Nate looked forward to the many happy evenings he and Steve would spend together playing with the model railroad. Yep. Next, Kathy opened her present. It was a doll. Kathy's 6-year-old eyes widened with delight. She knew all about how to look after a baby doll because she'd spent so much time helping her mother with Philip. Now they each had a baby. Steve and Kathy never let their gifts out of their sight all day. At noon, they sat down to enjoy the wonderful feast. The wonderful feast Marge had cooked for them all. Later in the afternoon, many of the young people from the Berean Bible Institute came to visit. The Saint's house was a natural gathering place for people in the area. Because his living room was filled with people, Nate perched on the edge of his bed with a typewriter in his lap, trying to finish a letter to his parents. He thought for a while about what to say regarding Operation Aka. It was a problem to him. He wasn't used to keeping secrets, so he had to be careful about what he said to his parents. He couldn't give them too many details. No one knew about their plans except the men and their wives. Aside from not wanting other missionaries to be unduly worried about their danger involved in what they are planning to do, they were afraid that if word got out about their plans, the Akas might be swamped with photographers and journalists coming to record Stone Age men meeting 20th century white men. While they needed secrecy, Nate also knew they needed prayer support, and his and Marge's parents could always be counted on for prayer during a new project. He started typing away. He wrote, "Please be in prayer for a special project the 3rd of January. We are attempting to contact a primitive group of Indians. I will be flying in support for the operation. I feel a real need for prayer to help at this time." A sudden move or a careless word at this critical stage in the operation could slam the door of hope on people who live in the Stone Age. The next day, Nate dropped the letter into a mail sack, and the letter began its long journey across the mountains to Quito and then on to Huntington, Pennsylvania. By the time it would reach its destination, Nate's parents would know far more about Operation Aka than the letter could ever have told them. A week later on New Year's Day, 1956, the final plans for Operation Aka were made. With Nate no longer planning to stay overnight in Aka territory, the men felt they needed some extra partners involved in the project, so there could be more than just Jim Elliott and Ed McCauley left on Palm Beach. There was safety in numbers. Pete Fleming agreed to be part of the group, and Nate had also asked Roger Yadirian from Akuma Station to join them. This brought the number of people on the beach during the day up to 5. However, because the treehouse Jim Elliott had prefabricated slept only 3 men, and because Pete Fleming was the lightest of the team, he was chosen to fly out each night with Nate. Each day, Nate flew over Palm Beach to check whether it remained in good enough condition to land and take off. Everything was on schedule and going according to plan. On Tuesday, January 3rd, 1956, the alarm clock jarred Nate awake at 6 in the morning. He had managed only a couple hours sleep. He had spent most of the night going over in his mind takeoffs and landings from Palm Beach. Nate went over every possible situation. On one landing, the plane plowed into the jungle, and another time it flipped over on its wheels, hit a stick that had gone unnoticed. Another time, Nate imagined that a group of ants had tunneled under the sand, as they often did, and when the cruiser hit the unstable sand, its wheels caught in the trench and spun the plane out of control. In his mind, Nate practiced for every kind of emergency procedure he had ever heard of, hoping he wouldn't have to use any of them. Nate also thought about the danger involved in what he was about to do. The men had done everything possible to keep themselves safe, but they had also promised each other that if Aka warriors attacked them, they would not shoot at them. They would only fire shots over their heads. There would be nothing worse than coming in peace to tell the Akas about God's love for them and then shooting them if things didn't go as they'd planned. Each man had pledged to the others that if it came to that, he would sooner die on Palm Beach at the hands of the Akas than risk killing people who had no idea who God was or that he loved them. Besides, Nate and the others had already faced the possibility of death. Being a missionary in the Ecuadorian jungle was not without danger. There were poisonous and dangerous insects and animals in the jungle. Tropical diseases also posed a threat to missionaries, as did accidents from falling trees or from drowning while fording one of the many rivers that crisscross the Orient. On top of that, Nate was a pilot, a job that had certain risks of its own, especially flying in the jungle. Long before he'd agreed to fly support for Operation Aka, Nate had come to terms with the fact that he might die serving as a missionary. At 8:02 a.m., 2 minutes behind schedule, Nate took off from Arahuno with Ed McCauley and some of the food supplies aboard. He had taken the door off the plane to enable them to transport bulky items. 15 minutes later, the two men were over Palm Beach. Nate swooped the Piper cruiser down for a near landing. As wind rustled through the cabin of the plane, both men peered at the sand racing past beneath them. Were there any sticks or new holes since the last time Nate had looked? They couldn't see any, so Nate banked the cruiser around for a landing. He set the flaps and slowed the plane as much as he could before setting his wheels down on the sand. The sand turned out to be softer than he had thought, but it was still firm enough to land and take off on. Nate cut the engine Nate cut the engine of the plane at the end of Palm Beach. He and Ed had made it safely, and they were now in Aka territory. As they sat in the plane for a minute, they thought about where they were, and they were both filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what lay ahead. The two of them unloaded the plane. Then Nate took off to pick up Jim Elliott and the pre-cut pieces of lumber for the treehouse. Ed waited on the beach for him to return, his ears alert for the slightest sound. It took Nate 5 trips to deliver all the men and the equipment to the beach. Once everyone and everything was there, they all knew what to do. Their first job was to put up the treehouse so they would have a safe place to spend the night. A nearby ironwood tree was chosen. As Ed and Jim hammered the first pieces of wood into the tree to use as steps, they quickly realized why it was called ironwood. It took longer than they'd thought to nail steps up the tree, but no one stopped until the work was finished. Jim gave directions on how to arrange the planks of wood and pieces of iron for their treehouse 35 feet above the ground. Once the treehouse was finished, Nate and Pete Fleming felt okay about leaving the other 3 men for the night. The trio would be safe in the treehouse, and Nate would fly back first thing in the morning with more supplies. After all 5 men had prayed together, Nate and Pete climbed aboard the yellow Piper cruiser and took off from Palm Beach. As soon as he was airborne, Nate radioed Marge to let her know everything had gone according to schedule. It was a message she'd been anxiously waiting to hear. Before they headed for Arahuno, Nate and Pete had one last thing they needed to do. They had to invite their neighbors over to visit. Nate flew over the Aka village where they had been leaving the gifts and spoke into the loudspeaker. "Come tomorrow to the Kareri River," he tried to communicate in their language. As he looked down at the faces of the Aka, they looked puzzled. He wondered if they'd understood any of what he had just told them. Only time would tell. The next morning, Wednesday, as soon as the fog had cleared, Nate and Pete flew back to Palm Beach and waited for the Aucas to arrive. No one came. It was the same on Thursday. The men discussed the situation. There was no way of knowing whether or not the Aucas had understood. Maybe they didn't realize how close the men were to their village. Maybe they thought it was a trap. All the men could do was wait and pray that someone would have the courage to come and meet them. Meanwhile, there was plenty to do around the campsite. Nate, as usual, kept a diary. This time, though, his typewriter had been too heavy to fly in, so he wrote by hand in a small pocket notebook. Except for 47 billion flying insects of every sort, this place is a little paradise. With the help of smoke and repellent, we are all enjoying the experience immensely. A little while ago, Jim pulled in a 15-inch catfish. It is roasting over the fire now. Ed had the latest edition of Time magazine with him. He read bits and pieces aloud to them all. President Mrs. Eisenhower had another grandchild. 5-year-old Prince Charles of England had given his mother a painting of herself for Christmas. The head of General Motors, Harlow Curtis, was Time's Man of the Year, but it all seemed a million miles away from the tiny strip of sand clinging to the side of a river on the edge of the Amazon basin. Every hour or so, Jim Elliot waded out into the river with his Auca phrase book. From the middle of the river, he would yell words and phrases into the jungle. "We like you. Come and visit us. We will not hurt you. Come and eat with us." Each time a bush rustled or a bird squawked, the men turned to see if they had visitors. But no one came.